Chapter 5. An hour later, back at the cove, Pete staggered over to a tree and crumpled against it. He was a wreck. His t-shirt was torn and bloodied. Mud was splattered across his chest. His hair was tangled. His belt hung loose from the 2 belt loops, and one of his shoes was missing. More blood, I told him. You need a little more blood on your forehead. I squashed some more berries, mixed with juice and a little Chuck's extra thick tomato sauce, and I smeared the gooey mess on his forehead. Then I stood back and admired my work. Pete grinned. How do I look? He asked. I mashed a fistful of mud on his left shoulder. Horrible, I said proudly. Really horrible. In fact, I think I'm going to be sick. We were making our way back to the girls' camp when suddenly we heard their voices ahead of us on the trail. Quickly, we ducked off the trail, circled around closer, and checked out the situation. Jill was down on her knees pouring some white stuff on the ground. It took me a few seconds to figure out what she was doing. She was making a plaster cast of an animal track. I knew because I had read an article about how to do it and had always wanted to try it myself. Sunny, meanwhile, was standing there with her arms crossed in front of her and the weight on one foot, telling Jill about a book that she was reading called Famous Stunt Women of Hollywood. She was saying how one of the women in the book was especially good at jumping onto things like moving trains and stagecoaches and stuff like that. And Another woman specialized in falling off things like buildings and cliffs and so forth. Actually, it was all pretty interesting, and I could tell from Pete's expression that he would have liked to stick around and hear more. But we had a job to do, and we had to do it now, before Pete's blood dried up and began looking like tomato sauce. I nudged him and we melted back into the forest, circled back around the trail, and started toward the girls. By the time they saw us, Pete was limping along beside me, clutching my arm for support. There was a dazed expression on his face. Those claws, he was babbling hoarsely. Those horrible claws. I heard the girls gasp. Sunny stood frozen, her mouth open. Jill, rising slowly to her feet, dropped the bucket of plaster on the ground, and the white liquid poured out all over the trail. Don't worry, Pete, I was saying soothingly. It's over now. You're going to be all right. What happened? Blurted Sunny. She was gaping at Pete's torn shirt and blood wounds, looking horrified. Jill's expression was harder to read, but I thought she looked pretty upset too. Pete moaned. It's nothing, I told him. He's okay. He's just scratched up a little bit. He was attacked by a wolverine. A what? Said Jill, shifting her piercing blue eyes to me. A wolverine. A really big one. Don't let him get me, Pete screamed, shielding his face with his hands. He began to topple over backward. I caught him just in time. It jumped on him from a tree, I explained. But I have to give Pete credit. He put up a good fight. He fought like a lion. That bit about the lion was Pete's idea. I felt pretty silly saying it, but he made me promise to work it in somewhere. At least it was better than saying that he fought like a dozen wild Tasmanian devils, which is what he really wanted me to say. I told him to forget it. Pete's eyes were wandering aimlessly, focusing on nothing. He rolled his head slowly in sort of a circle. What's a wolverine? Sunny asked nervously, twisting her long blonde hair with her fingers. She had hardly taken her eyes off Pete. I've never heard of one. I'd been counting on that because I hardly knew anything about wolverines myself. All I knew is that they were about 4 feet long, they looked a little like small bears, and they are fierce fighters, and they can kill animals much larger than themselves. They're about 4 feet long, I said, and they look like a little small bear, and they're very fierce fighters, and they can kill animals much larger than themselves. So much for the facts. Now for the fantasy. Actually, I went on, I think this may have been one of your North American vampire wolverines because of the way it went for Pete's neck. That shook him up. Even Jill. She looked a little white. Of course, I added, they don't actually suck blood. It's just that they always kill by going for the soft underside of the neck. This is kind of fun. And tonight, I thought to myself gleefully, was going to be even more fun. A bit of the berry juice and tomato sauce oozed down the side of Pete's face and dripped onto his shirt. Doesn't he need a doctor? Jill asked me. Pete began to come out of his daze. He lolled his head in Jill's direction and crossed his eyes. Doctor? He said weakly. I think a little first aid should do it, I said, trying to sound like someone who stays cool in an emergency. I'm going to take Pete over to the mainland and see if I can get some help at the lodge. I just came by to find you, so I could warn you about the wolverines before we left." "You think it'll attack again?" Sunny asked with a worried voice. I shrugged. "You know how it is. Once a wild animal has tasted human blood, he is never the same again. But I wouldn't worry about it if I were you. It's a big island, and I doubt I'll be able to find you." I let that sink in for a few seconds. While I did, a bird suddenly made a fluttering sound in a nearby bush. Jill and Sunny practically jumped out of their tennis shoes. Mission accomplished, I thought. The groundwork has been laid, and it was time to be moving on. "Well, I'll be seeing you," I said casually. "Pete and I better get moving if we're going to get to the lodge before dark." I patted Pete tenderly on his shoulder, and then I took his arm. "You ready, old buddy?" He perked up. "Go bye-bye?" he asked cheerfully. I turned him around and led him gently away. "We did it!" whooped Pete. "They were scared, really scared." "But not as scared as they're gonna be," I said in high spirits. Pete did a spooky version of his whistling wind sound effects. Then, making his voice low and quavery, he said, "As darkness falls over Turtle Island, the dreaded vampire Wolverine begins to prowl." He snickered wickedly. "They'll run screaming right into the lake." I grinned. We can only hope. And that was chapter 5.